Hey there YouTube, if you clicked on this video, I do appreciate it, and I'm betting maybe you want to upgrade the air conditioning on your old ride. So this is a 79 Ford, as you can maybe tell by the headlights and grille, and it originally came from the factory with air conditioning, but as you've probably surmised from the title of this video, it does not have all the factory components anymore. Let me give you a brief description of a basic air conditioning system, and then I'll show you what I have changed on this truck as well. Starting in the engine bay, we have the compressor, the heart of the closed loop system that is air conditioning. And you can see here that I have upgraded the air compressor from the factory York style air compressor to a more modern Sandin style air compressor. And from the air compressor, we have our high pressure line that is custom made that feeds the condenser. The next stop is the condenser. And as you can see here, the silver condenser is a little different than the factory condenser that would have come on this truck. The vehicles at this time used what's called a serpentine condenser. Basically, the Freon made one continuous loop in a serpentine fashion, starting at the top. It was just a tube and fan condenser. And those are great because you can clean them out by blowing compressed air and a solvent through them. However, they do not do as good of a job at transferring heat. This is called a parallel flow condenser and is a more efficient design. And it works better with the 134A Freon that this truck uses. And that's why I chose this. I picked the biggest condenser that I could make fit in the factory location. And I've seen some people who have used two condensers in series with one another, stacked one on top of each other to increase the flow. Well, not the flow, but the heat exchange capacity. After the condenser, there is a high pressure line that feeds the receiver dryer here, or the filter dryer rather. And this is not in the factory location, but it was a good place that was out of the way to put it. And as you can tell, or I don't know if you can tell or not, here's my hand for reference, it's a lot bigger than the factory one, so it has more capacity. It adds more total capacity to the amount of refrigerant in the system at any given time. And then there's a hard line that is bent around and converts back to a hose that makes its way over to the expansion valve. So all the tar looking material you see right there is actually an insulation that insulates the bulb, the sensing bulb of the expansion valve. And but that brass piece that looks like a thermostat below is the expansion valve that meters the amount of refrigerant that goes into the evaporator. And this is really the only part of the system that is factory. The expansion valve and the evaporator. The evaporator is in this box here. That is where the low pressure refrigerant cools the evaporator, which cools the air that's recirculating inside of the truck. And then of course, where that line with the tar is, it loops back to the compressor and we have a full loop. So another important part, although not exactly a part of the air conditioning system, is the radiator and fan. The radiator is out of a 90s model F-Series truck with a 460, and the fan, I believe, is an Aerostar fan. Whenever the air conditioner clutch, well actually just whenever the air conditioner has power, the fan is spinning regardless of engine temperature. Otherwise, the fans come on as required to keep the engine cool. And to help direct a little bit more airflow through the actual radiator and condenser assembly here, I've added some, which I'm sure this was actually factory, this truck just didn't have it. I've added back some rubber pieces, as you can see, that keep it from recirculating hot air from the engine. So let me give you a little background on my air conditioning system. When I first got the air conditioning system working on this truck, again, it was all factory components, factory air compressor and factory tube and fan condenser. And I wasn't really ever satisfied with how that worked. I mean, it kept the cab somewhat cool, but not really much better than keeping the windows down with 134A refrigerant. I really wanted this thing blowing snowballs. And so that's why I elected to go with the modern parallel flow condenser, the modern compressor, the larger filter dryer, and those sorts of things. The main part of this system, though, that has not been changed, the evaporator and the expansion valve, are parts of the system that I would have to recommend somebody changing if they were to want to do an upgrade to their existing system. And what I mean by that is I have found it awfully hard to really find an expansion valve that is calibrated correctly for 134A and the size of this system. And I'm sure there's people out there that know how to do this, but it hasn't been the easiest thing in my experience. I believe if I had to do it all over again, whenever I made my new lines, I would just eliminate the expansion valve and install an orifice tube and a high pressure and low pressure switch at a minimum that would cycle the compressor and turn it into a cycling air conditioning system instead of one that runs constantly and has an expansion valve metering it. But the system actually works pretty good, and I'm still glad I did it. So, for what it's worth, there you have it. There's my air conditioning system.
You're fine.
Play that last one. If I had to do it over again, I think actually that I would leave the expansion valve out of the equation and just go to a simpler setup, the orifice tube. And I guess in some ways it's simpler, in some ways it's more complex. I would have to add in at least 2 more switches to the system, a high pressure and a low pressure switch, and possibly an overpressure switch in the compressor. But I really think an orifice tube is a little more forgiving, and they're super cheap, so I could do a little bit more experimentation with it and really get my system dialed in. So, if there's a takeaway from this video, I want you to use as big a air, what is this called? Oh, never mind, we'll cut it there. So the big takeaway in this project for me is use as big a condenser as you can fit, and consider going to a cycling orifice tube system. And maybe you'll have air conditioning as cold as mine. I'll see y'all next time.